will be starting in, I think, 5 more minutes. And till then, I'm posting the link of the text. Yeah. Till then, I will be posting the link of the text right here in the chat box for those who don't have it. Um, the, yeah. I hope the link works over there. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we'll be starting in 5 more minutes. We'll wait for more people to join us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll start now. Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon to Professor Norris, and thank you for joining in for this conversation on philosophy and poetry. And as this talk is going to have somewhat of a flexible structure, it's mostly going to be comprised of like Professor Norris like reciting a poem from his recent collection, the link to which is in the chat box, and like then talking about the collection. And there's Professor Ashley, who teaches English literature at St. Stephen's College. He will be the moderator for our discussion, and he will be posing questions and so on. And uh, towards the end, we'll have a question and answer round. That's when we will be opening the floor to questions from the audience. So, yeah, please hold your questions till then. And I'll introduce Dr. Norris. Professor Christopher Norris is a distinguished philosopher, literary theorist, and poet, widely regarded as one of the world's leading scholars on deconstruction, especially the work of Jacques Derrida. Formerly distinguished research professor in philosophy at Cardiff University, he is the author of over 30 books spanning philosophy, literary theory, critical theory, and modern intellectual history. Dr. Norris is perhaps best known for his widely used introduction to deconstruction. This one right here, I think several of us would have read it. In addition to his work on Derrida, he has written important texts on Alain Badiou and Spinoza. And this is what, so when just a bit of information, maybe too much information, when I had initially emailed him several months back, I had reached out to him to have a talk about philosophy, but that's when he had told me that in recent years, following his retirement from academia, he has turned himself towards poetry, and he now describes himself as a full-time poet. And that is what moved us in this direction, and that's why we are now having this conversation about philosophy and poetry, because that is a very interesting move, I believe, and there's a lot to gain to talk about it, both from the ambit of philosophy and of poetry. Over the last 5 years, he has published several collections of formal verse poetry devoted to major figures in modern thought and literature, including Theodore Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Derrida, and a recent volume published in December 2025 on Ludwig Wittgenstein, published by Cambria Books, titled Whereof, Poems After Wittgenstein. So, with these works, he brings together his long-standing engagement with continental philosophy into a new creative register. And this bringing together of philosophy and poetry is what is going to be the focus of our discussion today. So, thank you very much for making our time for us, Dr. Norris. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to everybody for joining us. And now I would like to hand it over to Professor Ashley to perhaps give a few words before, yeah, please take over, sir.
Thank you, Arihant. Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
Good evening, Professor Christopher Norris. It's amazing. It's a singular honor to be here moderating this session in the Professor Norris's talk. As a reader of and a teacher of literary theory, one has worked with Professor Norris's work, but I didn't know about this new turn, the full-time poet's turn, and thanks to Arihant and Philosophy Society of St. Stephen's College to for this updation. And the book is a December 2025 book, so it's just 2 months old. Before I request Professor Norris to take us through the poem and tell us about this amazing work. I'm also amazed at the staggering inadequacy, the staggering intellectual inadequacy of somebody like me to talk about Wittgenstein. I mean, it's just, he's a philosopher. One was sort of in awe of one, but at the same time didn't really, know the philosophical system. One is really, not very clear about how philosophy department talks about it and so on and so forth. Even then, one thing I found very interesting is that as a teacher, when you have to use these aphorisms, and many of them belong to Wittgenstein, though I don't have a very clear idea when you talk about do not for heaven's sake be afraid of your nonsense, pay attention to your nonsense, or death is not lived through, or a picture held us captive, and it lay in our language, and it seemed to repeat itself to us inexorably, and we can't get out of it, and things like that, which is and the central idea of I'll teach you differences from King Lear that he thought we won't use an epigraph and all of that. So in some sense, Wittgenstein is as Terry Eagleton somewhere says, he is a philosopher of poets, playwrights, novelists, and composers. And in that sense, it's very interesting. There are lots of works about Wittgenstein elsewhere, and people have written about it, novels and poems and so on and so forth. We'll talk about that. But Christopher Norris, as a philosopher, as an intellectual historian, writing about Wittgenstein, and using Wittgenstein's lines as epigraph, developing a whole poetic treatise is a very interesting intellectual exercise. And before we go into anything, I think we are very happy and fortunate to have Professor Christopher Norris here. So may I request Professor Norris to start his presentation, reading, telling us about the work. Over to you, Professor Norris. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'll start by offering a bit of background, beginning with rather anecdotal background, and then get round to talking about the general topic of philosophy and poetry and the different ways in which those two kinds of writing can relate. And then I'll take some individual poems along with their epigraphs, because most of the poems in the book come with a quotation from Wittgenstein. Some of them very short quotations. He was a very skilled writer at producing very short, some aphoristic, very pointed, concisely phrased, and often very deep and thought-provoking quotations. And this is partly, I think, the source of his appeal. They have a habit of sticking in the mind and applying themselves to various occasions. And I think part of the fascination, the draw of Wittgenstein's writing is that he joins that tradition of, one thinks of it partly as a German, but partly as a French tradition. The ability to open up whole new topics of debate in a very brief, well-turned and thought-provoking turn of phrase. So there's that. Then there's also the larger background of the question of philosophy and poetry, going right back to the ancient Greeks, going back to Plato, the whole debate about whether poets are in the business of telling the truth, whether they're in the business of rational thinking. Socrates' famous objection to poetry is that poets literally don't know what they're talking about. They can write about any topic under the sun. They can turn their hand to any topic you propose to them. But behind that, there is nothing like adequate knowledge or expertise or genuine deep acquaintance with the topic. And he associated poetry, Plato that is, but Socrates before him, associated poetry with sophistry, with the art of the rhetoricians, whom he regarded as perverters of knowledge and corrupters of youth, and he had a whole string of charges to lay at their door. So the history of philosophy and poetry is not an entirely smooth or peaceful history. There's been antagonism and suspicion on both sides, which is unfortunate, which many poets and many philosophers have seen as unfortunate. Wittgenstein was steeped in poetry. He didn't see himself as a poet, but he saw himself as someone who was, to some extent, trying to introduce a kind of peaceful outcome of that old antagonism. He saw it as especially the task of German or German language philosophers to mediate, to find some way of letting into philosophy some of the themes and some of the modes of treatment that he found in the poets. The point about these poems is not so much that they join that tradition, because they're very different. The poets he was thinking of were really poets who were steeped in German philosophy from the late 18th century, well, from the early 19th century down. German poets and philosophers had been much closer than any poets or philosophers in the English language tradition. This is partly due to the influence of German idealism, Kant and the post-Kantian philosophers, Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, right the way down to Heidegger. The fact that all of them took a lively and deep interest in the goings-on of German poetry, so that Heidegger was steeped especially in Hölderlin and to some extent in Rilke. And one finds the English Romantic poets like Coleridge going to Germany, sitting in on the Coleridge. There's a big debate about whether Coleridge really got it right about German idealism, and many scholars like René Welleck would say no, he simplified it, misunderstood it, misused certain metaphors from German philosophy. So there's a big debate, a scholarly debate, a critical debate about the extent to which English Romanticism was influenced by German Romanticism, and whether that influence was often had a distorting effect on English Romantic thought. But generally speaking, Wittgenstein's attitude to poetry was that poetry was the source of deep insights, that they weren't amenable to rational explication, that poetry was, if you like, a language game, to use one of Wittgenstein's favorite metaphors. A language game, not in the regular sense of game, not something playful and light-hearted and a leisure time activity, but a language game in the sense that it has certain rules, conventions, ways of proceeding, certain pre-understood standards of performance and of play, which couldn't be spelled out fully. They relied partly on tacit knowledge, tacit understanding. And this was Wittgenstein's central point about language, I suppose, and the reason why poets have been attracted to Wittgenstein. As was said, that poets and novelists, writers of fiction, people like Thomas Bernhardt, and poets felt that Wittgenstein opened up a new space, opened up room for a kind of philosophizing that wouldn't be in any of the existing philosophical schools. It would be beyond anything that they'd encountered, say, in analytic philosophy, which is very much a matter of logical analysis, of often highly technical, logic-based analyses of linguistic expressions that take sentences of ordinary language, ordinary English, let's say, and then spell out the underlying logical structure of those statements. This is what Wittgenstein started out by doing. In his early book, the only book that was published by Wittgenstein in his lifetime, was the book he wrote early on when he first met Bertrand Russell in Cambridge. It was heavily influenced by Russell's philosophy, which is basically a philosophy of logical analysis. But then at the end of the early book, which is called the Tractatus Philosophico Logico, what is it called? I always get this wrong. I muddle it up with Spinoza's. Anyway, the Tractatus, as it's known as. The first 9/10 of that book is devoted to constructing a very elaborate, very detailed, hugely complicated logical framework that Wittgenstein started out by thinking was adequate to the purposes of philosophy. The structure is often rather confusing, actually, because it's based on Spinoza's structure and Spinoza's ethics. And that, in turn, was based on Euclid's geometry, which was also laid out in the form of a framework of logical concepts, axioms, corollaries, a very detailed and rather baffling, because so complicated, logical scaffolding. That's how Wittgenstein started out. He wanted to do something like what Russell was doing, the logical analysis of language. I mean, to give you an example of what Wittgenstein started off doing and then gave up and rejected completely. Russell would ask questions like, what do we do with a sentence, a statement like the present-day King of France is bald? On the face of it, since there is no King of France, because France is a republic and has been for 2 centuries, that sentence is neither true nor false, which is a problem for philosophers, at least for logically minded philosophers, because logically minded philosophers like to attach truth values to statements. They see statements as being up for discussion in terms of truth or falsehood. But if they refer to a non-existent or fictive or made up object like the present-day King of France, then that seems to escape the grasp of logic because it doesn't have a truth value attached. Russell said, right, this shows us what we've got to do as philosophers. We've got to analyze language and show that beneath these everyday, ordinary language expressions, there is a deeper, more lucid, more logical structure. So, Russell said, what we have to do is spell out that sentence, the present-day King of France is bald, and we spell it out in the form of a series of propositions. There is one and one only object, X, which is the present-day King of France. X is, there's one and only object, X, which is which refers to the present-day King of France. X is the King of France, and X is bald. Okay, so there is a false statement there, and the false statement is there is one and one only entity, and that is a false statement because that entity doesn't have the characteristic of existence. It doesn't exist, therefore there's nothing to refer to. And Russell's assumption, right the way through from his earliest adventures into the philosophy of logic and language, is that is a paradigm of what philosophy ought to be. It should be framed in the form of logical analysis. It should be rigorously consequent, and it should take ordinary language and show that it is systematically misleading. This was a popular phrase among the logical philosophers in Russell's and the early Wittgenstein's lifetime. It was the idea that language is systematically misleading. What we have to do is sort it out. Russell continued to believe that. He never really let go of that belief. He recognized there were problems with it, and those problems could be very serious. This was a message brought home to him by the very similarly minded philosopher Frege. So Wittgenstein started out with convictions very close to Russell's. He went to Cambridge to meet Russell. He thought Russell was the only living philosopher who was capable of helping him or living up to intellectual standards. But he rapidly became very disillusioned with that idea. And in the last pages of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is the title, he renounced it. He said, but there is a whole dimension of human experience, of human life, of meaning, of intelligibility. There's a whole dimension of language which goes beyond statement. And the distinction he draws is between saying and showing. And that's one that will come up in the poems in several different contexts. To say something is to make statements. It is to provide an adequate, properly articulated, grammatical, sense-making statement that bears on some intelligible aspect of experience or the life world, let's say, and which we can appeal to if we want to sort out the muddles and the dilemmas and the confusions in ordinary language. In the last 5 pages of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, what Wittgenstein says is showing is much more important than saying. Saying covers only the very limited technical ground of the natural sciences, mathematics, insofar as we want to express mathematical truths in natural language, which is to a limited extent. But showing goes far beyond that. It may be a matter of actions, exemplary actions, individual human beings exemplifying, let us say, trust or courage or good faith or sincerity or commitment or whatever. That's a kind of showing. It may take the form of language, in which case what is shown in language is probably best shown in poetry, because according to Wittgenstein, poetry doesn't and need not obey the rules or the axioms of logical propositions. Language is not propositional in poetry. Or, I mean, Wittgenstein doesn't rule it out entirely, and he was fascinated especially by a poet called William Empson, whose poems are very well, in the literary sense, conceited. They're full of complex ideas which are then spelled out, often in propositional or at least quasi-propositional form. So they are complex intellectual poems. They're other things too. They're love poems, but even his love poems they have the appearance of a logical argument. They involve at least elements of deductive logic. So Wittgenstein, in his first book, turns away from the analysis of language, of ordinary language in logical terms, and turns toward a kind of poetry. He once said in a very teasing and provocative way, philosophy can only really be done and should always be done in poetry. He didn't say in verse, which is a significant distinction. But what Wittgenstein means by poetry is the kind of poetry he read in Hölderlin and in Rilke. He associated it with the German language, like Heidegger. He tends to concentrate on poetry in that German tradition. And it's the kind of poetry that involves large themes of language, of history, of culture, of the Greek sources of German thought. The big theme in Heidegger, the idea that somehow modern German language, poetry, and culture had inherited the mantle of Greek philosophy. There's a kind of privileged link, if you like, or a kind of high poetic destiny that works itself out in that link all the way across the millennia, from ancient Greek to modern German. And of course, German culture, at least any sense of a unified German culture, was a very late arrival on the European scene, really, post Bismarck, post the mid 19th century, really, when the German states came together. So there's that intense awareness in Wittgenstein of poetry in that larger sense, something visionary, something peculiarly German. He had very little to say. He disliked Shakespeare. I mean, the British tend to take Shakespeare as a kind of litmus test, if you like, a poetic taste. And he was genuinely baffled by, Wittgenstein was genuinely baffled by Wittgenstein. You know, he said, I suspect that all these professors of English who claim to consider Shakespeare the height of poetic genius, you know, are fooling. You know, they're just sort of going on the bandwagon. They're trying not to say anything provocative. And he quite literally sort of scratched his head and was bewildered by the veneration of Shakespeare. So he had fairly fixed ideas of what should count as poetry, and it was really philosophical poetry. He had little to say about verse in the more technical sense, you know, verse structure, rhythm, meter, rhyme schemes, stanza forms, that kind of thing. So poetry for him was something larger, more encompassing, and in a way more ambitious in its scope. You know, something which, as he envisaged it, could not replace philosophy, but could offer a new way of doing philosophy, as far detached as possible from all the traditional ways of doing philosophy, but especially as far detached as possible from Russell's way of doing philosophy. So Wittgenstein was in many ways a rather agonized character, always felt out of place. He was not exactly antisocial. I mean, he was very abrasive, very difficult, could be extremely rude. I mean, brutally rude, really, at social occasions. And a few of those come up in the poems. The main points, the main principles of Wittgenstein's later philosophy are firstly the priority of ordinary language, ordinary, everyday, sometimes colloquial language, as against the specialized languages of not only analytic philosophy, but especially that, but also the specialist languages of the sciences, and of some kinds of speculative thinking. Mathematics. Wittgenstein had, to begin with, a very ambivalent, and then toward the end of his life, a very hostile attitude toward the natural sciences. He started out as someone with a keen interest in the sciences. In fact, most of his academic ambitions lay in a scientific direction. He famously spent several years in Manchester, in the Department of Engineering there. And he took out a patent actually in aeronautical engineering. He invented a particular form of jet propulsion for helicopters. I've seen the patent application actually, and I'm pretty convinced it wouldn't have worked. The mechanical strains and stresses would have been too much for a rotor blade. I fly model airplanes, so I have some knowledge of the topic, and I think Wittgenstein's patent was a bit of a non-starter, but he retired from that particular project rather embittered, I think, about his lack of success. Had a keen interest in mathematics and mixed with mathematicians, but again with increasingly hostile and suspicious relations. He became deeply disenchanted with Cambridge mathematical culture. He fell out with Russell, mainly I think because Russell's central interest was and really remained in mathematics, although Russell's great mathematical project, co-authored with Whitehead, the Principia Mathematica, ran into the buffers at a late stage. It must have been a huge disappointment for Russell on a series of logical paradoxes, the famous Barber paradox. And it ran aground on other new mathematical discoveries, especially set theory. But Wittgenstein was deeply hostile toward mathematicians generally. Having initially moved in that circle in Cambridge, he became disenchanted with it, and so he was, you could say, I think safely and fairly, a very difficult, a very prickly and sensitive, touchy individual, who was a prey to obsessions and recognized this in himself. Then he saw his philosophy as being a way of working through and beyond and somehow getting on top of those neurotic obsessions. He was interested in Freud. He vacillated really between admiration for Freud's, well, he used the word clever, Klug in German, of Freud. And he didn't mean that entirely as a term of praise. He meant it partly as too clever, for his own good. That was the implication very often. But he found himself admiring Freud's insights, his psychoanalytic insights, despite feeling that they were threatening to him specifically, but also threatening to the patient of psychoanalysis through probing down too far toward the roots of neurosis. So there was a kind of distance keeping there. I think he rather suspected that some of his colleagues in Cambridge might have recommended a course of psychoanalysis to Wittgenstein, and he'd have received that recommendation with sort of a very chilly response. I think perhaps it would be an idea to start reading the poems now and then use the poems as platforms or jumping off points. So I can give you the page numbers or the poem numbers. Poems are all numbered. The first one I wanted to talk about was poem number 13, and it's on page 22. I don't know which is most useful for, I don't know which version of the text you've got.
I think the poem number would be correct because, we have, the poem number would be good.
The form number?
Poem number 13, I think, is Giving Philosophy Peace.
That's the one, yeah. Okay, so I'll give you, good. Okay. This is one of Wittgenstein's main claims, his main objectives. And it was the idea that philosophy is basically a kind of, if you like, a bother-headed business. It's a lot of people going around scratching their heads and desperately worried about problems, which Wittgenstein would say were unreal, because as soon as you try to rephrase them in language that was understandable by the average reader, if you like, or the average person in the street, whatever, They would disappear. They would seem, what's the English word, footling. They would seem sort of trivial and unimportant. So he said to his pupils in Cambridge, he was never officially a Cambridge teacher or lecturer or professor. He was around in Cambridge and didn't like it. He didn't like high table conversation. He didn't like the intellectual atmosphere. He spent a lot of his time seeing films, early talkies, films, and reading detective fiction, doing anything but engage in academic chat. So this whole idea of giving philosophy peace was very deep in him, really. Not to begin with, not when he was doing the Tractatus, that was specialized philosophy, he recognized that. But ever since writing those rather mystical, rather suggestive and poetic sentences toward the end of the Tractatus, he adopted this idea that the best thing he could do for his students was to say, give up philosophy. Do anything else you can. Do bricklaying or do poetry for that matter, or teach PE or teach anything you like, preferably practical, But don't for God's sake carry on doing philosophy. And he genuinely meant it. None of them took notice, unfortunately. Well, some did, but of course those you don't hear of. But most of them went on doing philosophy. And incidentally, a lot of them wound up here in where I am now, in Swansea, in South Wales, at the University of Swansea. And the department was very largely staffed by Wittgenstein's first and second generation students and by the students of those students of Wittgenstein. They gave the students a hard time. Eventually, the philosophy department was closed. He was a very controversial and very provocative figure, and his disciples were fiercely devoted, and their devotion took the form of sticking to their particular reading of Wittgenstein. And although to a non-Wittgensteinian it would seem as if they were all pretty much agreed on all the things that mattered about him, nevertheless their individual differences with each other became a disruptive and highly problematical factor, which eventually led to the department being closed. It's going to be opened again, I think. There are now moves toward reopening it, which is a good thing. Anyway, the whole idea of giving philosophy peace, it was a kind of, the philosopher Stanley Cavell uses this phrase, coaxing philosophers down and leading them back to the community home. Cavell is a very good commentator on Wittgenstein, very distinctive reader of Wittgenstein. And he sees Wittgenstein's later philosophy as being a cure for philosophy rather than an answer to philosophical questions. So this is a rather sort of critical take on Wittgenstein's idea. So I'll read you out the epigraph, the quote at the top of the page. The real discovery is one that enables me to stop doing philosophy when I want to. The one that gives philosophy peace, so that it's no longer tormented by questions which bring itself into question. So the poem goes, well, yes, we take your point. There's some who ought to take it more to heart, make it their creed, and self-disintricate from webs of thought where flies may buzz once from their bottle freed. That's another quote from Wittgenstein. He says, the business of philosophy is, or ought to be, letting the fly out of the fly bottle. So, it's buzzing around in there, bothered by all these philosophical problems. Take the lid off, the airtight lid, and just let it buzz out. And then it can buzz around in society, talk to other flies or other philosophers, and settle all these problems and bring peace at last. Still, there's the brusque but bracing quick retort. What if your language therapy should need, to back it up, whole libraries left short of shelf space, whole great forests left de-treed? Truth is, dear Ludwig, those wise things you taught had all the commentariat agreed that, lest untutored readers should distort your message, they be shown how best to read such nomic dicta with the full support of specialists, whose works are guaranteed to throw up further issues of the sort beloved of those with families to feed. And so the exegetes contrive to thwart by their excess the very purpose he denounced, although in words that seem to court such services despite the case they plead. So it's really a poem about the irony of Wittgenstein's claim to free the fly from the fly bottle, or to talk philosophers down and lead them back into the community where they can find peace at last. But of course, if you go to your library, university library, and have a look at the modern philosophy shelves, or the early modern philosophy shelves, you will find shelf loads of commentaries on Wittgenstein. And it's one of the, you might call it kind of deformation professionnelle or something, professional deformation, that a philosopher who claimed and genuinely wanted to stop philosophers doing philosophy, or to make sure that if they did it, they did it in a different form. They allowed the philosophical wisdom to be shown through what they wrote, rather than spelled out or addressed as an explicit philosophical problem. But the rate never slows down. The number of books on Wittgenstein, I would guess, in the Anglophone sphere, must exceed that of any other philosopher, I would guess, except maybe Derrida, maybe for very different reasons there, I think, because he's read by people in so many disciplines. But there is an irony, a very heavy irony about that. And I think it's understandable. It's because Wittgenstein was, in a way, not only saying we should do philosophy as poetry, but he was doing it. He was a very good writer. I mean, I think that in a century's time, perhaps, if it will last that long, people will say, they'll treat Wittgenstein as belonging to the history of literature, and he'll be taught on courses that would also include Pascal or La Rochefoucauld, or Nietzsche, perhaps, some of Nietzsche's more aphoristic texts, because he is such a brilliant stylist. And it comes across in translation. I mean, his translators, Anscombe and others, have done well to stick as close as they can to the German, except where, it produces a sort of a really ugly phrase in English, in which case they allow themselves a bit of license. But it really comes across that he does think in certain speech rhythms that have a kind of, they have a sort of thought lulling effect as much as anything. And that was partly, I think, what he was trying to do. Again, it's a question of talking down, restoring us to something that we've lost by being overcomplicated or over preoccupied with technical questions about language and knowledge and so forth. But again, as I say, the irony is it's produced such a massive, constant flow of commentaries. Let's move on to poem 15, I and Language. Wittgenstein was convinced that the first person pronoun I, was a source of philosophical confusion. He never spells out exactly why, but I think he's onto certain Freudian insights. He resists them in a sense. He doesn't want to attribute them to Freud because he disliked the whole business of psychoanalysis. I mean, the therapeutic business, the sort of trade aspect of it. And but he's at one with Freud, I think, in believing that the I is not just, the ego. Wittgenstein was very alert to the unconscious in himself and in other people. And he writes with this intense awareness of what he may let slip, almost like the Freudian slip, what Freud calls a parapraxis, the slip of the tongue that's supposed to be a kind of royal road to the unconscious for Freud and for psychoanalysts generally. So the I for him was, he was aware of the psychoanalytic aspect, also of the linguistic aspect of it. Linguists talk about personal pronouns in terms of, some of them call it a shifter. It's the kind of word in language that shift toward reflexive usage. So it would include words like I, you, he, and she. It would include things like here as opposed to there, because here is, where I am, where the I is located. It would include temporal shifters or deictics. That's the other technical term. So it would include now, for instance. The now is the now of the first person. But Wittgenstein saw all kinds of problems in that direction. He recognized the shiftiness, if you like, of the shifter. And he's got that much in common with Freud. So poem number 15, I and Language, with I in quote marks. just to make that point about the fact that it is a shifty use of language. It is a very elusive and complex form of self-reference. One of the most misleading representational techniques in our language is the use of the word I. And by misleading, Wittgenstein means it leads us beyond the confusion with itself, with the use of the word I, into all kinds of other confusions in or with language. Then Wittgenstein says, Freud's fanciful pseudo-explanations, precisely because they are brilliant, perform a disservice. Now, any ass has these pictures available to use in explaining symptoms of an illness. Wittgenstein comes down very hard on the notion of explanation, whether it's in the physical sciences or in philosophy or in psychoanalysis, as we can see here. So it kicks off with a quote from Pascal. As far as I know, Wittgenstein never quotes Pascal. He may somewhere or other. The difficulty, there's a big difficulty in saying Wittgenstein never mentions this or that because he wrote so much. Most of it didn't come out during his lifetime, but since he died, his disciples and other people now, third and fourth generation Wittgensteinians, have been busily editing all his rather scrappy notes into more or less coherent volumes. The first one was the Philosophical Investigations that came out in 1951, edited by Enscombe, one of his students in Cambridge. But there's been a steady flow of books, collecting and sorting them into what strikes their editors as being something consecutive and coherent, and making a book, perhaps a rather sort of loose assemblage of comments, but belonging together thematically. Okay, so the quote from Pascal: Le moi est aisable. So it appears you, Sir Ludwig, share the sentiment expressed so succinctly by Blaise Pascal, whose fears of ego's terrors you thus manifest. It's as if ego haunts its own frontiers, patrols itself like border guards, obsessed with tracking down the sound that strikes their ears, like I lamenting under house arrest. Your eye is a world horizon that inspheres not only ego's realm, but, way out west, the coastline glimpsed when ego's mistbank clears and language brings to view things long repressed. You don't think much of Freud, but testy jeers betray misgivings. Why not let the test be id's odd way of paying its arrears to Schopenhauer, so grudgingly redressed? Think how your own first-person pronoun veers from topping self's account to reinvest its balance in the slippage that careers along the meaning chain, and then no rest for hapless ego. Let them in, your fears, that maybe Freud's dark insights serve us best, if we're to grasp what he, St. Ludwig, hears in those unheimlich gaps, as host turns guest. We hear them too, who come to you with ears now finely tuned to catch them, whether blessed or cursed by tidings from our earliest years, to which, like you, we've suddenly regressed. Who else, the rogue collocutor, who steers your wider self off track, so you're possessed by demon doubts until a shift of gears, or language games, requires they stay abreast of rules drawn up to see that thought adheres to common usage, lest infractions meshed with your assurance that those mutineers need pose no threat to our or your night's rest. A bunch of things there, really. Yeah, le moi est aisable. The self is hateful. It's a feeling that gripped Pascal periodically. There's something self-delusive, something slippery, something dislikable, something self-obsessed and egotistic, and all those things. And in that sense, I think Pascal is really sort of getting intuitively at some of the points that Freud makes about the vulnerability of the ego, really, to inroads from the id and from the superego, the conscience that bears down upon it in Freud's tripartite model of the mind, but the id, which sort of bubbles up into it, which threatens it and dislocates and can tear it apart from below. The id and its power of invasion, invading the ego. And this that second verse, ego haunting its own frontiers. There are several passages in his later writings where Wittgenstein does get this impression of being somehow oppressed by the border guards set up by his own overactive conscience, if you like, partly a moral conscience. I mean, Wittgenstein was intensely ethical. I mean, and very self-consciously ethical, in fact. He was, or he could have been, a very rich man. He came from a very rich family. His father, Karl Wittgenstein, was an industrialist and the chief, one of the chief suppliers of arms to the German government in the First World War. Wittgenstein was keenly aware of that and gave away his virtually all his share of the family wealth, in fact, and lived a kind of saintly existence in a way. I know it comes across very clearly in Anscombe's writings and in the writings of those who publish memoirs of Wittgenstein, and it's quite a thriving industry of memoir writers. He lived in a very ascetic way. He lived in his Cambridge rooms with absolute bare minimum furniture, all of it very sort of wooden and hard and unforgiving. And it exerted a kind of fascination on his followers, something like a cult, I suppose it would have to be. I mean, there's good and bad in that, I suppose. It meant he was listened to with respect and his writings were respected, and hence the great industry of Wittgenstein commentary. But bad in the sense that it could produce institutional upheavals and rivalries and internal feuds that could be intensely divisive and intellectually stultifying, I think, in some ways. Going back to the poem, this brings up the whole question of Freud, and also to some extent of Lacan. Lacan's particular, very controversial reading of Freud, which is intensely language focused and which takes very seriously Freud's idea that the unconscious is structured as, well, I always quote that structured like a language, but Lacan was much more categorical than that. He's structured as a language, and wanted us to take that very literally on board. So this is Lacan's idea that the the ego is a very frail construct. It is borne along on the stream of signifiers with no ultimate, what's his phrase, point de capiton. That's like the buttons in a sofa or something that hold the cover down, to hold the leather down. So Lacan's view of the structure of the psyche is that it is very unstable, unsteady, constant, open to constant disruptions from the id and from the superego, and that the ego, the first person, is something delusory. It is not something solid and stable and something you can appeal to, you know, in the way of myself or yourself, for that matter. Yeah, hence the turn toward Lacanian language there along the meaning chain, the chain of signifiers, which is something that never ceases to move along. It doesn't have any stable rest points that we could recognize as a human identity or a self. And also from Freud, the word unheimlich, one of those curious, very German, sort of ambivalent words that seem to vacillate between opposite senses. Heimlich, secret, unheimlich. The uncanny is how Freud describes it. And the play of host and guest from the same, as deconstructive literary critics are fond of pointing out, these ambivalent senses embedded in the sense of very often very basic primal terms. Freud wrote a book called The Antithetical Sense of Primal Terms, which had a big influence on literary criticism in the early years, largely by William Empson, who picked it up, read this short book, and his book, Seven Types of Ambiguity, is the first full-scale application of psychoanalytic discourse to literary criticism. Yeah, so this poem is really making the point that Wittgenstein is in many ways more Freudian than he wants to let on. You know, he lets in that well, very qualified praise of Freud, but in fact he is more, I suppose this amounts to saying he's more a case for treatment than he wants to recognize himself. Okay, let's head on. Do interrupt me, by the way, if you want me to answer a question or read another of the poems. I've written just a series of numbers down here, poems I thought I'd read simply because I read them most recently. So, but if you want me to read another poem, if you've got any favourites
Please go ahead.
or poems, yeah, okay, yes, yeah,
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah. Enjoy.
yeah,
I
okay,
do have one request. There's poem number
yeah.
5, a very short one on philosophical jokes. Since we're already on the topic of Freud, can we also just do the one on jokes?
Oh, okay, yes, yes, fine. Okay, let's head back to that if you like. Yeah. Oh, it is very short, right? Yeah, and it's like a lot of these short poems early in the book. It is a joke. It's a straightforward joke, really, at Wittgenstein's expense. But I'm not quite sure why I put them up front. I mean, it gives a rather misleading impression because some of the later poems are long and they do deal, quite in an extended way with Wittgenstein's serious ideas. But yeah, okay then. So the quote from Wittgenstein is, "A serious and good philosophical work could be written consisting entirely of jokes." Um, and the poem goes, "True, no doubt, Ludwig, but one might demur should someone say, why didn't Wittgenstein give us a few, while wiser folk concur? Smart-ass one-liners, really not his line." Hmm. Yeah, well, it's not. I mean, the dominant impression you have of Wittgenstein is that he was a serious man writing about serious topics. What's joke-like is, I think, more like koans, really. I mean, very cryptic, very pointed, short sayings that are supposed to evoke a pretty serious matter, really. It's something that sort of echoes behind the words and which cannot be articulated, can't be propositionally stated. Um, yeah, but having said that, I mean, yes, he has some one-liners, all right. Yeah, but they're not smart-ass one-siders. But really, those early poems up to well beyond actually number 6 anyway. Yeah, I suppose the seriousness comes in. I mean, in poem 6, perhaps we'll do that one now since it follows on. Poem 6, it's the limits of my language. Wittgenstein was very keen on this idea. The epigraph here, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. He believed that very literally. He Whenever he reflects on the nature of death, he says we cannot intelligibly think about what death means or what it might imply or how we can experience it, because it is the end of life, and a life world is given to us from the first moment of life to the moment of death. And he never expressly said he didn't believe in an afterlife. I don't think he actually addresses that question, but it's pretty clear from the metaphors he uses, which very often have they imply the metaphor of the world as, well, they're not, it's not a metaphor. I mean, it's near enough true, a globe, but it is a globe that is circled and closed upon itself, and even to conjecture on life beyond death, or on reincarnation, or on any other sort of candidate for post-natural life existence of the soul, is for him simply a closed book. He neither denies it nor affirms it, but it takes us into the realm of nonsense, he would say, in the strictest sense. But as several of his commentators say, nonsense for Wittgenstein, Unsinn in German, is not purely dismissive. It is sometimes mere nonsense, if you like, bloßes Unsinn, or whatever the German would be. But nonsense can be important for Wittgenstein, and not only as a kind of negative cautionary thing, a kind of warning. Here begins nonsense, like here be dragons. Yeah, but yeah, let's look at this poem then, because it's not entirely comic. Flat earther to round earther, see my map. Push words too far, you'll drop right off the edge. Those language gamesters should just cut the crap, head home, and take the common usage pledge. Round earther, choose projections fit to wrap around the earth. Then that risk you allege turns out a language-generated trap in need of some good sense-supplying wedge. But either way, there's Ludwig, keen to tell cartographers its language games decide world boundaries, horizons, and where dwell the dragons loosed when words are misapplied. So hearken to him, if you'd lift the spell of errant language games or misapplied locutions that his word alone can quell, and thus keep those flat earthers well on side. That That's slightly mean-minded, that poem, but it raises a real worry, and that is that if you believe, as Wittgenstein did, that ordinary language is and must be the last court of appeal, it must be what in the end decides whether we're talking sense or nonsense, then you've effectively closed off any room for scientific development. I mean, the development in this case would be the discovery, by many people at the same time, that in fact the Earth was not flat. You didn't fall off the edge. You know, the further you voyage out in your voyages of explanation, the more it's brought home to you that that in fact it is near enough, at least, a globe. So the problem with the whole doctrine of language games, they push too far, and Wittgenstein did sometime push it too far, is that they encourage a very conservative, a very unadventurous, scientifically overcautious view of what language can in fact stretch itself around in the way of scientific concepts and explanations. As I said, for Wittgenstein, the idea of explanation is, at least he's not entirely dismissing it, but he's saying it's overworked and it's given too much credence. It's rested upon much too firmly in scientific circles. This is what he came to think when he'd really been totally disenchanted with Cambridge. And after he was in Cambridge at a time when Cambridge was a tremendous centre of scientific advancement and research. You get some idea of that from a poet and critic I mentioned earlier, William Empson, wrote a great book called Seven Types of Ambiguity. I mentioned it in connection with Freud. And he was very alive to what was going on in physics, especially nuclear physics, in relativity theory, in quantum mechanics, and he wrote poems about it. He got really good love poems out of it, out of these very complex, new, and very often alarming or disconcerting scientific ideas. But Wittgenstein was very resistant to them. He thought that the sciences had become far too much the sort of centerpiece of intellectual life. And it was true, certainly in Cambridge at that time. Had he been in Oxford, it might have had a quite different impression. The physical sciences weren't half as predominant in Oxford at the time. Of course, they weren't the only two universities, but one tends to think in terms of them. So Cambridge, there's these terrific things going on in the sciences, in physics and mathematics, mathematical physics, let's say. And Wittgenstein was not only largely indifferent to them, but actively hostile to them. So it's a kind of round earthers philosophy. If we take his doctrine of language games really seriously, or for that matter of forms of life, the two phrases go together very closely in Wittgenstein's writing. A language game only makes sense within a form of life. A form of life cannot exist. You know, we can't live within it and conduct fairly incoherent or non-productive, or any of the things Wittgenstein imagines. The Voldemort thing is from the children's book series Harry Potter. So everything that's sort of grim, repressive, sinister, and bad school teacherly. So this whole paradox in Wittgenstein, the fact that his philosophy relies very crucially on the creative resources of language, the ability of language, not only to create striking, novel expressions for familiar things, but also to change our view of familiar things. And those things include the objects of scientific inquiry, the fact that by re-envisaging something through a metaphor, through what begins as a metaphor, we can in fact make discoveries about the nature of the object or of the phenomenon that we're trying to explain. It's actually a big topic in philosophy of science, the role of metaphor. There was another Cambridge or Oxford, I don't know. Mary wrote a book on metaphor. It'll come back to me. Mary Hesse, that's right, Hesse, showing that the metaphor, in fact, is extremely productive and absolutely necessary if we're going to do any, not creative thinking, creative too vague a word, but any productive, progressive thinking in science. And the French thinker Gaston Bachelard famously wrote, he wrote about philosophy of science, and he also wrote about philosophy of poetry. and the unconscious and the way that the unconscious generates images and metaphors. But he was especially interested in the way that a metaphor in science reaches a certain point of development where it has to be turned into a concept, an operative, applicable, scientifically valid concept. And that's the point at which we may have microscopes that are more powerful, we may have concepts that are more adequate, and it ceases to be just a suggestive use of language that may point towards some kind of scientific advance. It becomes, the best word is operative. And that's something that Wittgenstein. Yes.
If you could just have some questions and some comments. Thank you very much for that wonderful reading and excellent remarks on Wittgenstein's poetry, Wittgenstein's philosophy, and poems and philosophical thought coexist in such a wonderful way. And I think the reason why Wittgenstein is such a fascinating figure for people is you can tell a lot of stories about him. How he would not attend Russell's classes and then sit under a tree, and then people would go and listen to him rather than Russell himself went to listen to those stories. There are those fascinating stories, and some way, it's also negative philosophy or anti-philosophy in the sense that, don't read any Aristotle, don't read any Hegel, that sort of thing. So, there is so much going on underneath. And what you're writing, to use a psychoanalytic sort of cliche or commonplace now, it's the tip of the iceberg, and then the poems are a philosophical entry into a very rich political, social, cultural, personal, emotional journey. And that's one thing there's a whole lot of subtext. It's wonderful. And the other thing I thought was the way you've used epigraphs. They convert Wittgenstein into a writer of amazing aphorisms, right? I was reminded of Adorno's Minima Moralia, or Baudrillard's School Memories, or Ionesco's Present, Past, Past, Present, those kinds of things. So there's a kind of editing that was really interesting. And one of the reasons why post-World War, post-Second World War, post-Eurocentric sort of thought resonates a lot with Wittgenstein's idea, or it finds a certain kind of a seed in Wittgenstein. I was reminded of Seamus Heaney a lot of times. I was reminded of Zen philosophy a number of times, and the way in which and your commitment is to philosophy and philosophical thought and intellectual history, and at the same time, when you talk about it, all of this comes alive. So much is there underneath that. It all came up alive. It's really wonderful. Thank you very much. One question I have is, your relationship with Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein becomes, a person you're introducing, a person you're conversing with, a person you are becoming sometimes. There is this different kinds of things, right? Like in this Dear Ludwig, and the German word Lieber, I think, I don't know how you pronounce it, meaning dear. And you use that, and Saint Ludwig, you use all kinds of, there are lots of names that you use for him. So the relationship with Wittgenstein is interesting. So I would like you to sort of tell us a little bit about that. The other thing is about epigraphs, because you've repeated some of them. You've used 2 or 3 and you've put them into dialogue with each other. So epigraphs, in some sense, you keep going back to some of the things. So there's a circular sort of thing, but each time it becomes something else. Initially, it's very introductory, and later it becomes dense philosophical thought. And then by the end, you talk about the last part. It's quite, it also feels very sad. There is an emotional side to it, but it's like the Roy says, the shell has the sense of a sea. So all of this is just suggested. It's not there. You don't explain it. You don't even describe it. You point to it in some sense. Like a finger that points to the moon or to the sea or something like that. So would you be able to elaborate a little bit on that? Would be great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, the poems vary a lot, I think. Some of them do identify to a certain extent with Wittgenstein. And I think many of his readers find that, he expresses, I think partly because he's very adept at flipping back and forth between everyday everyday locutions and situations and predicaments and philosophical topics. I think the one thing that he wanted to do and professed was his intention, and actually managed to do, was to involve the reader. In a way that most philosophy doesn't. Most philosophy, well, it doesn't exactly leave you cold, but the more technical, what he regarded as the aridly technical Cambridge philosophy that he encountered when he got there, mainly personified in Russell, was so remote from ordinary life. But at the same time, he retains the reader's interest by presenting views of ordinary life that are curiously skewed and complex and sometimes very distant, almost inhuman, in fact. Sometimes you can't make out the tone of Wittgenstein's writing. He was famously difficult to get on with in company. I mean, you were talking about the anecdotes and the number of anecdotes that have come down to us, but he could be impossibly rude. He went to a party in Cambridge, and there was a woman pianist playing, and she turned to him, knowing that he came from a musical family. His brother was Paul Wittgenstein, who lost an arm in the First World War. It was shot off or blown off, and he had a second career as a one-armed pianist, and composers like Ravel and who else? Erich Korngold wrote one-handed concertos for him, concertos for the left hand. So, tremendous sort of effort of will to master. These are really sort of fiendishly difficult concertos too. So he came from a musical family, and he himself was very musical. And she asked him, can you offer me any advice on my playing? And he said, how could I possibly, implying that her playing was so terrible that no advice would help her at all. And then he just walked out. And the critic F.R.
That incident of him punishing the student, physically punishing the students, I've read about it. I mean, I don't know very much. All those,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he desperately wanted people not to be interested in his life elsewhere. He took time out from Cambridge and philosophy and went to teach at a primary school in Norway. And apparently was a very brutal teacher. I mean, unforgiving, stern, inflexible, and beat the kids, quite simply. Nowadays he'd be imprisoned. Simple as that. But there was a book published by an American scholar called William Warren Bartley III, with three Roman capital threes, and he was chased out of that village by the villagers, in fact, by the parents, and who were very angry about this. And he was also, I mean, one great hardship he suffered throughout his life is that he was gay, at a time when to reveal that in public would have brought probably imprisonment, prosecution, a shattered career, and the end of any kind of life worth living. So, I mean, absolutely cruel social attitudes at the time. Had he been born 50 years later, or even 40 years later, his life would have been totally different. And that is in nowhere comes out explicitly in his writing. And again, it was in the book by the American scholar. And I use the term fluttered the dovecots. It caused great anguish among Wittgenstein scholars. Well, they professed great anguish and thought it was wicked to release these things, these facts about his life. Now it's quietly accepted, and no one makes fuss about it. And as I say, if he'd been born two generations later, he'd have been a much happier man and much less agonized, and his philosophy might well have taken a different form or stopped altogether. Who knows? A big thing like that is going to affect someone's intellectual performance, attitudes, ideas in unpredictable ways. But and I suppose in a sort of large human way, you feel the sort of the torments of his life. It does come through. It comes through in the aphoristic style. It comes out in the impatience, I think. And the energy of those aphorisms comes partly from impatience with the long-winded habits of academic philosophers, who they don't write aphoristically. They write great big treatises or tomes. And most of them, with the exception of Nietzsche. It's strange. Again, it's risky to say Wittgenstein doesn't say much or anything about Nietzsche, but I can't think offhand of it. Schopenhauer was important to him, And you can see that temperamentally Schopenhauer would have appealed. Schopenhauer, a deeply gloomy philosopher who thought that on the whole it's better not to be born rather than to be born, and that life was, he compared it to the wheel of Ixion, you know, the victim bound on a wheel in a fire, being constantly roasted and turned around. He thought, yeah, Wittgenstein agrees with Schopenhauer on one thing, though he doesn't make the Schopenhauerian connection explicitly, that aesthetic experience can give us a momentary release from the wheel of Ixion. It can take us out of the fire, stop us roasting slowly. It provides a kind of contemplative, not indifference, but a contemplative calm. And two things. He says he combines ethics and let's look at that one actually, because it's a very interesting poem. I've got to find it now because I hadn't originally planned. Oh yeah, it's poem 43. Right, there it is. Okay, yeah. Ethics and aesthetics are one. That's from Wittgenstein. That's one of his aphorisms. A very controversial statement. It's been much discussed, partly because many ethical philosophers or moral philosophers think we have to distinguish between ethics and aesthetics because, quite simply, ethics is more consequential. You know, it has, even if you're not consequentialist about ethics, it's consequential in the sense that it deals with problems that go about as deep as any do into human life or human common existence. And it has to do with matters of life and death, and with matters of conduct that themselves can be issues of life and death. Whereas aesthetics, you know, no matter how much you are engrossed or captivated by a picture or a poem or a work of music, no matter how subjectively, deeply you respond to it, aesthetics doesn't have that kind of ultimate significance, that claim on serious attention as being one of the conditions of human existence. If human being, you know, is going to survive. So it's a controversial claim, and many people would dissent from it, or at least want to qualify it quite heavily. The poem, your thought, both are conceived sub specie aeternitatis, not at all as we are accustomed to have deeds and things appear when met with in the course of everyday experience, but as singled out to play a role that could or should transcend the sphere of purposive cognition or of mere self-interest. So this is Kantian ethics versus consequentialism, or versus any kind of utilitarian philosophy of ethics. Thus they set us on the way to that which you, like Schopenhauer, portray as the best means to lift ourselves quite clear of all those base attachments that adhere to acts and objects brought beneath the sway of calculative reason. That might pay us off in terms of benefits held dear, or profit, or what's thought to interfere with that blessed state of mind in which they pray, the faithful, that no impure thought betray how such like worldly motives come to rear their ugly heads. They strip the thin veneer of contemplation from its underlay of motives, drive, desires, and all that they, aesthetes and ethicists, consider sheer backsliding, and a proof that such austere demands must always send some folk astray, since framed precisely, vide Kant, to say, abandon hope all ye who enter here, if not prepared when called upon to jeer at those who'll let some Lustprinzip defray the cost of keeping profit thoughts away, by having pleasure guards pace the frontier, where ethics and aesthetics tend to veer into a self-willed state of disarray. In other words, the big debates in ethics really turn on the debate between consequentialists who think that in the end it's a matter of human interests, the greatest good of the greatest number. It's a matter of what ultimately does most good to the most people and least harm. So it involves some kind of calculative thinking or reasoning, as opposed to those like Kant who believe that ethical judgments issue from high-level categorical imperatives, whichever version of the categorical imperative you tend to take, and that consequentially, his reasoning should enter into it nowhere. It's a very unforgiving, a very stern, high-level kind of set of dictates. But Wittgenstein seems, insofar as you can interpret this very brief statement and other brief statements of his, to think that there is a valid and, or he would say, a very important association between ethical and aesthetic judgments. They both involve some kind of, if you like, a view from above, though that's not what he would. They involve some kind of contemplation of human being in the context of ultimate things, if you like, ultimate duties to the other person. There's something of Levinas about Wittgenstein sometimes. It is a very demanding, counterintuitive, intensely demanding ethical view. The Levinasian idea that it must always be the other, the face of the other, or the appeal of the other, even the mute appeal of the other, that weighs most heavily in our considerations. There must be no trace of ego, no trace even of alter ego, of treating the other as another self. Many people would say, and I tend to feel actually, that behaving well toward other people involves treating them to some extent at least as other selves, recognizing their kinship to you, the fact that they share needs, responsibilities, their portion of the human, if you like, with you. Otherwise, you couldn't sort of judge what kind of behavior toward them is right, because you wouldn't be able to interpret them as living others whose needs and whose fears and desires and whose whole sort of conditions of life are recognizably akin to your own. This has been, well, it's discussed at great length by many philosophers, including people like Husserl, phenomenologists, who try to find room for the other, the significant other, if you like, in their own mental sphere. But Wittgenstein takes this very seriously, and I think he gets this partly from Schopenhauer. It's the idea that the most important states of human awareness are those where we're able to distance ourselves most effectively and most distantly from this incessant sort of striving that is the will to power, if you like, what Nietzsche will call the will to power. But Schopenhauer, it's the will, this sort of torturous inner drive that is never satisfied. There's a connection there with Lacan on the nature of desire and the slippage of the signifier. But I think that's why Schopenhauer gets, well, in a way, top billing for precursors to Wittgenstein. He recognizes that deep conviction that existence is something tormenting, something that is sure to involve torments that outweigh any pleasures or any source of relief, or unless we're able once in a while to release ourselves from the wheel of Ixion, from those drives, the will, which is everything from sexual drives to appetite for food, need for drink. It's everything bodily, and quite a large proportion of mental activities driven by the will, except to look at the picture, listen to a piece of music, read a poem that momentarily transports you to a realm from which those desires appear mere transient things, a kind of, well, it's what the Latin phrase in the first line of the poem suggests, sub specie aeternitatis, and it's a mystical feeling. It's what he was talking about in those last few pages of the Tractatus, I think, and it's what he finds especially in music. And there are some poems later on in the collection that have to do with his reactions to Haydn and Schubert and Brahms, the three composers who were most dear to him. Yeah.
One thing, may we have questions from the audience, please? Is that okay, Professor Norris?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to start with a small one, since we were just on poem number 43, Ethics, and it's from the aphorism Ethics and Aesthetics are One, and this is just a minor editorial question. So I noticed that this poem 43 is one of the only two poems in the entire collection which are without a title, the other one being 39, which is also like without a title. So I just wanted to ask, is there some significance behind that, some reasons for that?
41 too, actually. That's a quote from Wittgenstein at the top. Yeah, small thought to fill a
Right.
life.
Yeah.
I think there are. Yeah, it's just that some of the aphorisms were so short. I mean, the quotes from Wittgenstein are so short and so to the point, so apposite that I thought might as well use the quote. That's right. I don't know how they appear
Oh,
on
right.
the list of contents page, actually. Yeah, I don't distinguish clearly. Perhaps I ought to have done. I don't know. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So some are titles I've given, some are quotes from Wittgenstein, and some are no, that's it. That exhausts the field. Yeah, yeah. Mm.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Um,
thanks.
Any other questions?
any other questions from the audience, please? Yeah,
Chris.
Arpit, you can, yeah, please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Sir, my name is Arpit. I'm from BA first year English honors. As you have worked on Derrida very extensively, I wanted to ask about how do you think that Wittgenstein talks about language games? So he's also talking about the instability of meaning. And similarly, Derrida talks about deconstruction of presence. So do you think Wittgenstein provides a pragmatic counterpart to that? Or what's your opinion on that? How can we bridge those ideas?
Um, yeah, I think there's no quick and easy bridge. For one thing, Derrida is a much more close focus thinker. I mean, he's a great reader of texts, and his readings are very close focused. They're also more intent on the logical structure of the text he reads. I mean, I think one of the things that's not widely recognized about Derrida is that he is, among other things, a philosopher of logic. I mean, he seems to talk in a loose sort of way about the logic of supplementarity or the logic of the paragon or the logic of the pharmakon in Plato's Phaedrus, dialogue of Phaedrus. But he means it quite seriously. What he discovered in those early texts of his, Derrida, was a deviant or non-bivalent logic, not a logic of either or, but of anomalies that that complicate and in the end undermine the straight either or of bivalent logic. Bivalent logic's two-valued logic, it's true-false logic. Derrida is one of those philosophers, and there are many schools of non-bivalent logic nowadays, including intuitive logic, many-valued logic, quantum logic. I mean, one argument is that if you're going to accommodate the paradoxes of quantum physics or the paradoxes that appear if you apply true-valued logic, true-false, to quantum physical results, then you will run up against a brick wall. You have to recognize that it's about it's a field where both and applies rather than either or. So Derrida's one, he arrives at it by very different means. He arrives at it by the close reading of texts, like those of Rousseau or of Saussure or Levi-Strauss or of Kant in the essay on the paragon. He writes it through close reading and shows that beyond a certain level of complexity, bivalent logic doesn't apply, or rather it's forced into paradoxes which can only be resolved if you accept a many-valued logic. And in that sense, what he's doing is applying Derrida, this is, of course, applying Gödel's theorem, undecidability theorem, to texts, to written texts. Just as Gödel says, for any arithmetical, well, let's say mathematical or logical system, beyond a certain level of complexity, there will be certain propositions that cannot be, certain axioms rather, that cannot be proved or disproved on the terms of that system. In other words, there is an irreducible complication that prevents any sufficiently complex. That's a point that Derrida makes in different words, but he agrees with Gödel. So two very different disciplines, philosophy of mathematics and philosophy of literature, if you like, arriving at similar conclusions. The complexity is important because obviously a simple text, a nursery rhyme or something, is not going to lend itself to a Derridian reading, or it'll be an exercise in ingenuity on the reader's part. But Wittgenstein is trying to get away from that sort of thing. In fact, it's his central claim, I suppose, that kind of analysis, of course, he didn't encounter Derrida, but he encountered applications of philosophical logic that would be comparable to Derrida. And for that matter, he encountered philosophies of mathematics in Turing, for instance, early speculative thinking around computation and the possibility of machine thinking. That Wittgenstein found unwholesome, unhelpful, unwelcome, and intolerable, quite simply. So he sort of lost patience with them. But Derrida doesn't lose patience with paradoxes, or what he would call aporias, sort of points of blockage in a chunk of text, or in a text, a long text, let's say, like the Phaedrus, or like Rousseau's Essay on the Origin of Language, or Kant's Third Critique, where he writes about the Paragon, the complicated, self-contradictory logic of the frame in Kant's Aesthetics. So I think there's a huge difference of philosophical temperament between Wittgenstein and Derrida. And to some extent, I think it doesn't come down to sort of national cultural stereotypes, but there is something that remains very German about Wittgenstein's thinking, and something about Derrida's thinking that is very French. It goes back to what I was saying about Pascal, really, the thinking in terms of what language can tell us about its own complexities. Derrida's always the first to say it's the text he's reading that tests him. He's not being cleverer than the text. The text is cleverer than him, and if he can reveal something of the complexity of the text that's there in the words on the page, then he'll have shown something. But he's not claiming to be the one who complicates things and comes up with ingenious additional problems. So I think they're very different thinkers. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for
Yes, sir.
Sabdeshwar Chakravarti has a question. I think this, because of lack of time, this might have to be the last question of the evening. Yes, Sabdeshwar Chakravarti.
Yeah, hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you so much, the organizers and Professor Chris. Very enlightening talk, and your poetry is really, really exciting to read. It offers fresh perspectives on things. One thing I always feel about Wittgenstein, particularly his early writings, Tractatus, is this dichotomy, this impossible dichotomy between showing and saying. And you have already, in your poem on showing and saying, you do maintain that, well, so much for not being able to say it well, but you keep writing, endlessly write treatises and books to somehow, flesh out that which you are also aware can never be fleshed out enough. So that fundamental impossibility emerges quite well. At the same time, I think that there is a necessary possibility hidden in an impossibility, which is also evident in your work. Because I remember Derrida from the postcard where he says one-liner that what cannot be said must not be silenced, but must be written. And I think that is precisely what Wittgenstein himself did, and also I think you have done it wonderfully well, perhaps much better than him in many regards, because you've not made any claim to the established philosophical modality of doing things. You have taken on a different modality of poetry, of literature, and so on. At the same time, I think that while we talk about this notion of never being able to show enough, never being able to say enough, language always verging on this this ineffable logical form, essentially. In your first poem, it really struck me that there is a hint that there is possibly a way of bridging this gap in the way of being carefree. That's the last. If I could just read the last two lines of it. The first poem, Flying and Fly Bottle, which you also touched upon in the beginning of the talk.
Oh, yeah.
And they'll no doubt buzz ceaselessly until somebody leaves the stopper out, so careless. Do you believe that there is this notion of carelessness can be of philosophical utility in trying to bridge this gap? Because a lot has been said on care in philosophy, both in the sense of ethics and even Heidegger and many other people. Foucault and so many people. But do you think carelessness, carefreeness can be a possibility of doing philosophy? It can serve as a way in which we can sort of enable ourselves to do philosophy, or philosophy itself can enable itself. Do you think any of that can happen?
Yeah, I mean, there is such a thing as fruitful error. Yes, and I think, I mean, there are many schools of Wittgenstein interpretation, and one of them is a small school, but it produces some of the best commentary. Was that was started by a man called Balsma, an Indian scholar, as a matter of fact, who was one of the, I don't know whether he was first or second generation Wittgensteinians, but he certainly worked with Wittgenstein in Cambridge. And he devoted most of his writing on Wittgenstein to the idea that that it was wrong to consider Wittgenstein to be in any way conservative about language. And he went through Wittgenstein's writings, quoting passages that were much more adventurous and that broke far more freely with the conventions of usage, of everyday common usage. He thought that Wittgenstein really was writing a kind of manifesto for creativity and philosophy. And by that, he didn't mean that you could go high and wild. You know, you could say anything that came into your head and just sort of free associate. He didn't mean that at all. But he thought that some degree of selectivity should enter into it. But nevertheless, it was only by giving the imagination a good deal of, cutting the imagination a good deal of slack, if you like, letting the mind at least occasionally play around with ideas and follow out its metaphorical hunches. And he encouraged his students in America, he taught in America eventually, C.K. Balsma, or no, O.K. Balsma. I don't know what the initials stand for. But yeah, and that, I think, I don't know if Derrida ever discussed that particular idea, but Derrida wasn't particularly keen on Wittgenstein. He must have read Wittgenstein. I'm sure it's come up in interviews, and don't think I never talked to him about Wittgenstein. Talked to him about some things, but not Wittgenstein. But of course, he did read Austin, J.L. Austin, and famously, notoriously wrote about Austin, and did some wonderfully inventive and philosophically consequential things with Austin's texts. But the great difference between Austin and Derrida was that Austin was playful. In a very sort of, strangely enough, it's a paradoxical this is, in a very sort of Oxford Common Room way. Austin gets all his examples of ordinary language philosophy from a curiously sort of unordinary, unrepresentative line of talk. It's English, all right, but it's very much the English of an upper class, Oxford educated. It's all about hunting and fishing and the things that the English used to do in their leisure time. And but the playfulness is what Derrida latches onto. Whereas that there is not most of the playfulness in Wittgenstein, unless you supply it in the way these comic poems do, is, well, it's not really there. At least he regards playfulness in language as being irresponsible and reprehensible and misleading, all those things. And you can catch him out doing inventive and sometimes quite idiosyncratic things with language, courtesy of the interpreters, the translators. But yeah, Derrida's was obviously drawn to Austin in all sorts of ways. It doesn't mean he goes along with Austin's thinking. In fact, he takes issue with Austin on Austin's whole notion of speech act authenticity, and he deconstructs it with relish, in fact. But you can see why Derrida would latch onto Austin rather than Wittgenstein, because he'd be put off Wittgenstein, I think, by the appeal to, well, ordinary usage. And Derrida is, he's nothing if not an inventive writer. He's a wonderful prose stylist. And the philosophical thinking is carried in a crucial way by the way he writes too, not just by the metaphors, not just by poetic turns of speech, but by a very self-aware style, sort of striking sparks of whatever he's just said, in fact. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Professor Christopher Norris. That was wonderful. I think there is one question that Arihant asked before we go.
Yeah. Thank you for this talk, Dr. Norris. This was really interesting, and I was particularly interested by this talk because what your poems, what your collection of poetry does, is something it gets touches upon something that I've always been fascinated in with Wittgenstein as a figure. That he's on the one hand a philosopher. Coming out of the tradition of British logical positivism and atomism and so on, but on the other hand, he's like a figure of so many anecdotes, and he's always introduced with all your eccentricities. And I, as somebody who studied him in a philosophy department, was able to notice this difference in the treatment of him as opposed to other philosophers, where you simply just get on with other philosophers. But with Wittgenstein, you're always, given prologues about how he was an eccentric and so on. And these two aspects of his thought, I don't really find very often, put together and dealt with philosophically. Like, for example, as it would be for other philosophers, like, Ellen Badiou and Barbara Cassin have written a text on Heidegger where they write about, like, Heidegger on the one hand as a Nazi and other hand as a philosopher. And I think what your text does is, like, it's one of the few texts which brings together these two aspects of Wittgenstein. I think Ellen Badiou's Wittgenstein text is also one which does that. And my question is about how Wittgenstein, like, you talked about the whole machinery of Wittgenstein commentary that has come about. And I want you to talk about how exactly British analytical commentators sort of deal with this strange figure. Because the way I see Wittgenstein over there is that in their desire for, like, the early analytic philosophy, like perfect logical language and so on, Wittgenstein emerges there as a sort of a trauma in the psychoanalytic sense. And, like, he's, like, bringing out these strange aspects of ordinary language and life and so on that they want to foreclose. And I think that if Wittgenstein had not written the Tractatus, his early work, and just had written the philosophical investigations, and that had text has come out, then I think he would be very easily ignored by the analytic tradition. But the reason why they have to wrestle with him is because, like, it's with Picasso that they have seen, firstly, that he can draw such realistic portraits, and then he chooses to do that. So he moves from that to this. And in that, I find him very interesting. But there's a lot of repression going around with Wittgenstein. Like, even in his own text, he has, like, references, and he has intellectual interests. And he's talked about jokes, he went to films, detective novels, but none of that really comes into his philosophy. And similarly with Wittgenstein commentary, I think the reason why he's one of the most written about philosophers, at least in the analytic history of analytic philosophy, is that it's we got into psychoanalysis. It's like an obsessional neurosis trying to, foreclose this aspect of, like, it's like running away from the peace that you talked about in one of those poems. That Wittgenstein as a philosopher is, really doing something dramatic to analytical philosophy. And I would like you to comment on that, like how, as a strange figure, he's dealt with. And just, yeah, I hope that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, well, it sort of brings home one of the differences between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. I mean, they're impossibly broad categorizations, really. So they're not that much use, but they're useful up to a point. And one, I mean, to take an example of the way that analytic philosophy keeps the life out of the work, keeps a very rigid, compartmentalized distinction between the two things. Would be an Oxford philosopher called Michael Dummett, who was a great commentator on Frege, wrote a number of big books, really sort of standard works on Frege. So his Dummett's interests were in language, logic, truth, mathematics too, insofar as questions of truth and falsehood come into mathematics. All right, and he worked for years on his first big commentary on Frege. And discovered toward the end of his research period that Frege had been a supporter of the Nazi Party, that he had some terrible attitudes, that he was deeply misogynistic, that he was anti-Semitic, that he and Dummett himself was the opposite. He was liberal. He worked for better race relations in Oxford during a period of race violence, and he was appalled to find this. But he says in the preface to the book, nevertheless, he went ahead with his work and he published the book because Frege's philosophical work was so utterly remote from his opinions and his prejudices and his sort of everyday life, the man Frege, if you like, that really the two things didn't meet at any point. So this new and shocking knowledge about his life and opinions didn't impinge on his philosophy at all, which was philosophy of logic. So about as far as you can get from everyday life, really, I suppose. So that would be the analytic attitude in very pure form. I don't know, with Wittgenstein, I mean, there are those who say, those who took umbrage at the Bartley book, thought it was shockingly revelatory. It was pernicious and mischievous, and it was roundly denounced, because it knocked quite a lot of presumptions about Wittgenstein over, and it came as a shock to the Wittgenstein community, the commentariat, as they call. But the truth is that, even Wittgenstein's points about language games and forms of life, and all his points about where language goes wrong and language going on holiday, and Wittgenstein on metaphor, they are all very much, they're Lebensphilosophie. They always take examples from everyday life, sometimes his own. You can see their autobiographical elements there, and it's impossible to ignore them. To carve them out and to treat him as his work as purely philosophical would be a massive distortion, really. And he was, I think, he wasn't a show-off in any way. He was quite a reclusive individual and didn't enjoy social occasions. He was quite autistic, I think, quite way out on that scale. And had severe social difficulties. But his life gets into his writing in all sorts of ways. Some of them that he doesn't seem to recognize, and some of them that he very clearly does, and he uses them, in fact, as illustrative. So it would be artificial, and it would falsify his work in its wholeness, to cut them out and to try to draw some sort of line. And I think most Wittgensteinians now recognize there's a place, most of them who were his students, first generation Wittgensteinians, have written memoirs, either memoirs or full-scale books. And the best, at least the most sort of widely recognized and referenced biography is by Ray Monk, and it's subtitled The Cost of Genius, or The Price of Genius. And it is, I think it's a kind of hagiography, actually. He's very selective about what he does include and doesn't, and he certainly regards Wittgenstein as being, his other book, Ray Monk's other biography, was a 2-volume work on Bertrand Russell, and his dislike of Russell comes through very intensely there, especially Russell's behavior toward the women in his life and toward other philosophers. But whereas I think of Russell as being a deeply flawed, but on the whole, decent human being. He certainly had his faults, but generally speaking, he was generous and had intense sympathy with the sufferings of the world, and was a good public philosopher. He actually, he deconverted me from Christianity anyway. He wrote a wonderful little book called Why I'm Not a Christian, which is far less sort of hectoring and aggressive than Dawkins or Sam Harris or the others. It's quiet, ironic, and utterly convincing, I think. A really nice piece of writing, quite apart from anything else. But so I disagree. Ray Monk thinks Wittgenstein was great, despite his sort of strange attitudes and his life problems and the rest of it. Nevertheless, he's he buys into the cult, or the myth, the saintly myth, if you like. With Russell, he really dislikes his subject. It must have been depressing for Ray Monk to write two volumes and all about someone he deeply disliked. But so it's it's complex. It's impossible not to be curious about the lives of the great philosophers. If you might take an example, I suppose Kant would be an extreme example. Most people who write about Kant spend their time analyzing Kant's philosophy and following out the implications of his ethics or his epistemology in the first critique. And Kant's life was famously boring, regular as clockwork, and all the myths about the townsfolk setting their watches and clocks by him. So nobody, there are biographies of Kant, but they're pretty exiguous. They squeeze out the points of interest. With Wittgenstein, it's inevitable. There's a kind of inevitable pull toward interest in the life, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry to so it's a beautiful conversation and should go on, but then the time is it's almost 8 here. It's been 2 hours, so I think Professor Norris will also be tired. It was really a very dense, lucid, and insightful talk, and it was a wonderful evening. Professor Christopher Norris, thank you so much for that,
Well,
and
thank you.
thank you Philosophy Society for this event. Thanks a lot, Arihanti. Take off.
Yeah. Um,
Thank
yeah, just a short note. I would just like to thank everybody for joining this evening and for this rich and stimulating session, Dr. Norris. And on behalf of the Philosophical Society, I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to you for your time and for this, very thought-provoking conversation that you have brought to us. And this session is particularly, I think, important for the history of the society, the Philosophical Society, because it was founded in the early 1940s by one of our professors, Professor S.K. Bose, who was also one of the students of Wittgenstein's. I'm not sure which generation, perhaps second, perhaps first. And so, yeah, that's why it's also significant to have a conversation Wittgenstein and poetry, something that's quite lacking in general Wittgenstein scholarship. So, thank you for that. And thank you as well to everyone in the audience for your presence, for your participation, and I hope your engagement with your engagement is what makes events like these meaningful. So we hope this conversation can continue beyond today, and we look forward to welcoming you all to future events. And the recording for this talk will be available on YouTube, so we can those interested can be revisiting it on our YouTube channel. It'll be posted in a day or two. So good evening, and thank you once again. Thank you, Dr. Norris. Thank you, Professor
Thank
Ashley.
you. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Thank you. And the questions.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
so
Bye,
much.
everyone.